Daily life in Babylon. A mix of routines and traditions that might seem both familiar and also foreign to us. You see, on one hand, the ordinary people of Babylon rose with the sun, worked to feed their families, raise their children, and gathered to share meals. And those are certainly ordinary rhythms of life that we can all recognize. But on the other hand, they did so in a very different world, one of clay tablets and cuneiform script, and in the shadow of those towering ziggurats, under the rule of powerful kings and ancient gods. And so today, we will explore the everyday experiences of the common Babylonian during the city's golden age under kings like Nebuchadnezzar II. We'll take a walk through the streets and homes of Babylon's citizens and peek into their work, leisure, family life. And we'll also see how law, religion, and culture shaped that world. But before we go back in time, allow me to welcome you to the channel. Hello to any newcomers, and welcome back to anybody who's returning. I will begin with the customary acknowledgement that we are completely ad-free across the entire breadth of this channel, all the playlists, and that is because we are supported by the patrons and also the YouTube members, those who choose to donate from time to time, and also those who check out the merch store. So thank you very much to all the supporters. But if you can't afford to do that, then just enjoy the content. A great way to support us is just by liking, commenting, subscribing, because that helps push us out in the algorithm, and it really does help. So, with that being said, we won't harp on about all of that. Let's go back to Babylon first, shall we? And we can see what a normal day was like for a very normal Babylonian. We find ourselves not in the Bronze Age, but rather in the 6th century BCE. Babylon was at the glittering heart of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and arguably the largest city in Mesopotamia, if not the world. And that's why we've chosen to put our exploration at this time, because this is the height of Babylonia. Well, ancient writers and modern archaeologists have marveled at its scale. By Nebuchadnezzar II's reign, that is from 604 to 562, Babylon's population is estimated to have exceeded 100,000 people. Now that's a colossal number for antiquity, running far beyond the 25,000 or so who lived there in the earlier times under Hammurabi. You know, the one who did the law codes and all that. Well, this dense urban center sat on the Euphrates River, whose life-giving waters flowed right through the city, dividing it into eastern and western halves. The river was both a trade highway and also a source of irrigation and drinking water, integrated so closely with the city that walls and quays lined the riverbanks and gates opened directly onto the water. Approaching Babylon, a visitor in antiquity might first be awed by its defenses. The city was encircled not by one but two massive walls of mud brick and baked brick. Classical accounts describe the outer wall as extremely thick and tall, so broad that chariots could supposedly race atop it side by side. While Herodotus's figures may be exaggerated, as he was prone to do, and then again people were certainly prone to romanticize Babylon's grandeur quite a bit, there's certainly no doubt that these walls were formidable engineering feats. Dozens of bronze gates pierced the fortifications, the most famous being the Ishtar Gate on the north side. Passing through Ishtar's gate was an experience in itself, its deep blue glazed bricks adorned with striding bulls and dragons symbolizing the gods Adad and Marduk. This grand gate opened onto the processional way, a wide stone-paved street that ran through the city center. During New Year festivals, statues of the gods were paraded down this avenue, and on ordinary days, it served as a main thoroughfare for carts, soldiers, and citizens on foot. But if you go inside the walls, Babylon was a bustling metropolis. laid out with a surprising degree of regularity. Major avenues ran straight across town, intersecting with smaller lanes that crisscrossed the residential districts. Unlike the tangible maze of streets in many old cities, Babylon's planners, perhaps following the ancient urban traditions, had imposed a grid-like order in parts of the city. The Euphrates River bisected Babylon, and numerous ferries and bridges connected the two halves. Herodotus mentions gates at each riverside street end, suggesting that people could descend to the river to fetch water or cross by boat. At peak hours, one can imagine a lively scene on the river, ferry barges shuttling passengers and goods, ferrymen casting nets, and children, of course, playing at the banks. The architecture of Babylon reflected both function and social life. Along the main avenues stood buildings such as temples and palaces, constructed with impressive baked brick masonry. The royal palace complex, that being Nebuchadnezzar's grand residence, loomed behind its own walls in the heart of the city. Meanwhile, ordinary houses filled the side streets. If one walked down a typical neighborhood lane, the view might be unremarkable at first. Mud brick walls lining both sides, interrupted by stout wooden doors. Windows facing the street were rare, and when we say windows, we just mean holes in the wall. For privacy and security, that is. Most houses presented blank facades to outsiders. But stepping through a door would reveal the characteristic design of a Babylonian home. A central, open-air courtyard with rooms around it. Houses were often 1 or 2 stories tall, built of sun-dried mud brick, with wood used for doors, roof beams, and furnishings. In some wealthier quarters, houses of 3 or even 4 stories have said to have existed. A testament to the engineering skill of Babylon's builders, but also the congestion of a city that encouraged building upward. These multi-story homes would have been the exception. Most families likely lived in more modest, single-story dwellings. But within each home's courtyard, daily domestic life unfolded in view of the family's eyes and the open sky. The courtyard provided light, ventilation, and a workshop for tasks like grinding grain or weaving. It was here that children might play under the watch of elders, and household members would gather in the evening to cool off after the sun's heat had faded, perhaps under the awning or beside a water jar. Many houses even had their family tombs under the courtyard floor, generations of ancestors buried literally at the heart of the home. It was common to inter the dead in large clay jars or simple brick vaults beneath the house, and we know because we found plenty of them. Far from being morbid, though, don't get me wrong, this practice reflected a profound reverence for family continuity. The home was not just for the living, but also a resting place for forebears, keeping their memory and spirit close. Neighborhoods in Babylon often grew around kinship groups. Extended families lived nearby or even in adjacent homes, creating close-knit clusters of relatives. If a son married, his new household might be established just down the lane from his parents. Because of this, Babylonians rarely sold their family homes. The house might pass down through generations, carrying the legacy of one lineage. Property deeds on clay tablets show this continuity too, with homeowners proudly referencing their fathers and grandfathers who held the house before them. One consequence of this attachment to ancestral homes is that Babylon's residential districts had a degree of stability. The same families dwelling in one quarter for centuries. A stroll through such a neighborhood in Nebuchadnezzar's time might reveal a pleasant mix of consistency and change. Elderly grandparents sitting at a doorway who remembered the city under previous kings. Children playing games with clay marbles. and young adults discussing news from the palace or the market. But despite the high-density urban environment, Babylon was not devoid of green or open areas. Here and there, small gardens or orchards existed, sometimes within wealthy estates or temple precincts. Date palms, figs, and pomegranates could be grown in irrigated plots, and there is evidence of household gardens providing vegetables or herbs. Of course, the most famous garden associated with Babylon is the legendary Hanging Gardens, reputedly a marvel of tiered greenery and flowing water, if you believe the stories. And if this garden truly existed in Babylon, which some scholars think it did, perhaps within the palace grounds, while others suspect it was later confused with gardens in Assyria, it would have been a royal showpiece, rather than part of ordinary life. Common citizens couldn't just rock up and stroll through the Hanging Gardens, but they might have heard tales of its lush terraces, or seen its verdant outline rising above the palace walls. Even if the Hanging Gardens were more myth than reality, Babylon's inhabitants certainly took pride in their city's beauty. The processional way, for example, was lined with carved stone reliefs and regularly maintained, giving citizens a grand path for religious processions and civic events. Babylon's status as a cosmopolitan capital also meant that its streets echoed with many languages. While the native populace spoke varieties of Akkadian, the Babylonian dialect in daily life, by the Neo-Babylonian period, Aramaic was also commonly heard. It had become a sort of lingua franca of the Near East. In markets and taverns, one could hear traders from far-off lands, Egyptians, Persians, people from across the empire and all beyond, all adding to the city's character. Among the residents were also communities of people brought as captives or migrants from conquered regions. For instance, after Babylonian armies under Nebuchadnezzar II conquered Judah in 587 BCE, thousands of Judeans, ancestors of today's Jews, were deported to Babylon. These Judean exiles settled in and around the city, some even forming their own villages, such as Judah Town, recorded on cuneiform tablets. Thus, walking through Babylon's streets, one might encounter a group of Judeans speaking their Hebrew dialect, or see them maintaining their own customs while trying to adapt to Babylonian life. The daily scene in the city would strike us as bustling and vibrant. Morning began early, with the Mesopotamian climate. Dawn and dusk were the coolest times, thus favored for work. As the sun rose, city gates opened, and villagers from the surrounding countryside began streaming in with farm produce, vegetables, jars of milk, baskets of dates, and caged chickens to sell in the market. Donkeys, laden with sacks of grain or bales of wool, clattered along, urged by shouting drivers. As noon approached, the heat would grow intense. Many Babylonians took a midday rest. Laborers sought shade, perhaps napping in the courtyards or under a tree if available. The wealthier might retreat indoors where thick mud brick walls kept interiors relatively cool. And in the royal palace and temples, the work continued. Scribes in the palace chanceries and temple storehouses kept records even at midday, though they too might pause for a brief meal of bread, beer, and onions. But in the evenings, the city stirred back to activity when temperatures eased. Families gathered on their flat rooftops or courtyards to catch evening breezes and socialize. One could hear music drifting from the open windows, the strumming of lyres, or the reed melody of a flute as people relaxed. Street vendors might pass by with late-day snacks, perhaps grilling skewers of meat or selling cool drinks made from fermented barley. As dusk fell, lamplight began flickering in doorways and shrines. Babylon didn't have streetlights in a modern sense, of course, so travel after dark could be risky. Most people stayed close to home at night. Nonetheless, special occasions or festivals brought out crowds even after sunset, and the city's nightlife, in taverns or private parties, could be quite lively when circumstance permitted. And this was the stage upon which daily life played out. A dense urban environment of high walls, narrow lanes, and grand public monuments. Babylon was both a city of brick and mortar, and a community of people from walks of all life. All walks of life, rather. Excuse me. Well, with the city itself in mind, let's step a little closer to those people within it. See how Babylonian society was structured, and what family life looked like behind those courtyard walls. Of course, at the center of Babylonian daily life was the family. Society in Babylonia was strongly patriarchal and family-oriented, but within that framework, individuals enjoyed warmth, support, and, surprisingly, well-defined rights. A typical Babylonian household was an extended family unit, potentially including not just parents and children, but also grandparents, unmarried adult siblings, and other relatives. Living next door to one another or even under one roof, these kinship groups formed the basic building blocks of the community. The male head of the household, often the eldest father or grandfather, held legal authority over family affairs. However, Babylonian women also played an influential role within the home and beyond. More so, in fact, than women in many later classical societies like Greece. A Babylonian wife and mother managed many day-to-day matters of the household, supervising food preparation, the care of young children, and the work of any servants or slaves the family might own. Yeah, they had them too. Everyone did. Well, when I say everyone, I mean pretty much all societies. Well, women were not cloistered. They could go out to the market, to the temple, or to visit neighbors, and many worked outside the home in various capacities. Evidence from legal texts indicate that women could own property, initiate divorce, and even appear in court on their own behalf. For example, a Babylonian woman could inherit her father's estate as a daughter and pass on property to her own children. Some women even served as priestesses in temples, or as officials overseeing parts of temple workshops, which gave them economic clout, arguably the best kind of clout. There are records, too, of female tavern keepers, indicating women could engage in business. Running a beer house was a pretty common profession for women in Mesopotamia. Compared to many ancient cultures, Babylonian law and custom granted women a respectable status. Certainly not full equality, but definitely a recognized legal identity. From birth, children were cherished in Babylonian families. In a typical household, young children spent their days around their mother and other female relatives, learning language and basic skills by observation and play. Parents showed affection. A number of Mesopotamian lullabies have been discovered, indicating mothers sang to soothe infants. Childhood in Babylon likely involved informal play, with toys like clay dolls, rattles, miniature chariots that archaeologists have all found, and early training in household tasks. A boy might follow his father to the fields or workshop as soon as he could walk steadily, learning how to water a garden or shape a brick. A girl, similarly, would learn from her mother on how to grind grain or weave wool into yarn. Education for most children was practical and home-based. But for some, Formal schooling was an option. You see, Babylon had a long tradition of scribal education. Boys, and possibly a few girls, though most scribes were male, from families of means or scribal lineage, might attend the Eduba, the scribal school. Here, under the tutelage of experienced scribes, they spent years mastering cuneiform, which is their writing system, and of course the Sumerian and Akkadian languages of literature and law. Now, this was a demanding education. It required students to memorize hundreds of wedge-shaped signs and practice by copying lists of words and classic texts. A student's day in Babylonian schools might start early with the recitation of lessons. They sat on the ground or benches with clay tablets on their laps, a reed stylus in hand. The teacher, often called school father, would assign lines from proverbs or model contracts to be written, and then check the results, not hesitating to use the cane on a lazy or sloppy pupil. And indeed, some surviving student tablets are complaints about the teacher's harshness. Apparently, they would be quite liberal with the whip. But literacy was a rare and valuable skill, so a successful education opened the door to respected careers as scribes in the royal administration, temple bureaucracy, or even private businesses. But this path was for a minority. The average Babylonian child did not attend formal school, but learned the family trade and skills needed for adult life. And then there came marriage. That was the central event in Babylonian family life, typically arranged by families when the individuals were young, teens most likely, though exact ages varied. Marriages were formalized by contracts recorded on clay tablets. These survive in large numbers, revealing the typical terms. The groom's family would pay a bride price to the bride's family, compensation and the sign of a union's legitimacy. And the bride would bring a dowry of goods or property to the new household. The marriage contract often included clauses regarding what would happen if the marriage came to an end. For example, how the dowry would be handled in case of divorce, indicating that, well, divorce, while not common, was permissible. And if a marriage was childless, that could be grounds for the husband to take a second wife or a concubine. But this was, once again, relatively rare. Monogamy was the norm. One fascinating, though likely outdated custom of marriage that Herodotus describes is the marriage auction. According to him, in older Babylonian villages, when they would annually gather all marriageable young women and basically auction them off to bachelors. The beautiful girls fetched higher prices, of course, while the plain-looking girls were essentially paid for with that money as dowries, so that every woman found a husband. Herodotus presents it as a wise custom, ensuring all women married with some economic balance. He adds that by his time, the 5th century BC, this practice had fallen out of use. Modern historians are skeptical, though, if this auction ever truly happened as described. It may be a traveler's tale, but it reflects the idea that marriages were community affairs, arranged openly, rather than romantic elopements. In any case, once married, a woman entered her husband's household, but she did not become a powerless figure. As mentioned, she could own property, and she had rights under the law. In the Babylonian law codes, for example, the earlier Code of Hammurabi, whose principles were still known in later eras, there are numerous provisions protecting wives and mothers. For example, if a husband divorced his wife without cause, he had to return her dowry and pay compensation. Wives could initiate divorce in cases of cruelty or neglect. although they may have to forfeit the dowry in that case, so, you know. The bond between husband and wife was ideally one of mutual duty. The husband provided a home and income. The wife managed the household and bore children. Of course, children were the desired outcome of marriage, and fertility was a major concern. If a couple struggled to conceive, they might resort to prayers and offerings to fertility deities, such as Nanaya or Tammuz, or the husband might take a second wife or a concubine as a childbearer with the first wife's consent. The second wife would have lower status, though. An alternative seen in documents was adoption. Childless couples sometimes adopted a child, often from within the extended family, to be their heir and care for them in old age. In fact, adoption contracts are a common record in Babylonian archives. They formally establish the adoptee's rights and obligations. For instance, an adoption tablet might say the adoptee, quote, shall be son and heir, and if he does not honor the father and mother, he shall be disinherited. Pretty clear rules. Conversely, the parents would agree to rear the child properly and fulfill their obligations. And this shows that beyond blood ties, Babylonian families could be formed by legal and emotional bonds of adoption, demonstrating an element of compassion and social stability. Daily routines within a household followed a rhythm shaped by practical needs and the natural environment. At dawn, as the father and the older sons departed to fields or workshops, or to the city gates if they had business outside the city, the mother and daughters began the day's domestic work. The first task was often to grind barley or wheat into flour using a grinding stone, a laborious chore usually done by women or servant girls. This flour would be the day's bread. Baking was done in simple clay ovens or hearths in the courtyard. Flatbreads could be slapped onto the hot interior walls of a tanur oven, or dough could be baked in shallow pans. Alongside bread, a typical breakfast for a Babylonian family might consist of beer. Yes, beer in the morning, although not strong like our normal beer. It might have been like 0.5%, this sort of thing. But it was still a staple nourishment. Well, perhaps it would be diluted too and sipped. And some dates or boiled porridge too would be the standard fare. Children might have a bowl of milk or yogurt if the family kept goats. After the morning meal, the household split into its various duties. Women took charge of textile work, spinning wool into yarn, dyeing it, and weaving. The clack of the loom was a common sound in any home, as making cloth for clothing was an ongoing task. Women also tended any garden the family had, watering vegetable plots or fruit trees. Fetching water was vital. Not all houses had wells, so water had to be brought from communal wells to the river. Women typically carried big water jars on their heads or shoulders, making trips as needed. Laundry was done by scrubbing clothes in tubs or at the riverside and laying them to dry in the sun. Inside the home, one might find a few pieces of furniture, beds or cots, perhaps a low table or two, and reed mats to sit on. The floors were usually packed earth swept clean. The wealthier homes could have brick or plaster floors. The walls might be plastered or even whitewashed to reduce dust and brighten the interior. Decorations were minimal, but they could include wall niches for lamps or small figurines of gods. Every house likely had a small shrine or altar to household gods or protective spirits, where a lamp or incense might be lit daily. Babylonians also took personal cleanliness seriously, living as they did in a hot climate. If the Babylonian family could afford it, they would have oil for things like soaps and lotions. Now, as for bathing, that was done with water in basins. an outdoor bath in the courtyard, or a quick rinse at the river. Think about it like that. Interestingly, Herodotus observed a custom that after a man and wife had intercourse, they would both wash and anoint themselves with incense before resuming any daily activity. This suggests there were notions of ritual or hygienic purity related to intimate parts of life. Also, there's evidence that menstruating women followed certain purity practices, like staying apart or refraining from temple visits during that time, common in many ancient cultures, by the way. But when the men of the household returned from their work, be it farming, soldiering, craft labor, whatever it was, the family would reconvene for the main meal. Dinner in a Babylonian home might be a stew of lentils or beans flavored with garlic and leeks, eaten by scooping it out with the flatbread. If they were a little bit better off financially, there could be some mutton or goat meat in the stew, or even roasted fish from the river, along with onions and cucumbers. Beer, of course, was the usual drink for adults, served in large ceramic jugs, which family members might drink with long straws to filter out solids, since the Babylonian beer was unfiltered and porridge-like. Even children drank a form of beer, though possibly very diluted. Water alone was not always safe, and beer offered a nourishing, mildly fermented alternative. Another beverage was date wine, a sweet alcoholic drink from fermented date palm sap, which some families made. For dessert, if such a word applies, they had dates, figs, or a treat of honey if available. Now, here's one aspect of the Babylonian household that stands out, and that's the presence of slaves and servants in some families. Slavery existed in Babylon, but it was not quite the mass chattel slavery of later Roman times. A family of means might have one or two slaves, perhaps a girl purchased to help with domestic tasks or a man captured in war, now working as a field hand. These slaves were considered property, but they did have a few rights under the law. For example, killing someone else's slave was an offense requiring compensation to the owner. Slaves could also eventually buy their freedom or be freed by their masters, especially if they were debt slaves, people who had sold themselves due to unpaid debts. As noted earlier, slavery was often temporary in Babylon, a way to work off a debt over some years. Additionally, children of slaves might not remain slaves. If a male slave married a free woman, their children were always free. And this meant that over generations, many slave families merged into the free population. Daily life for a slave in a household was full of drudgery, but slaves lived alongside their masters, often ate the same basic food, and, well, in some cases were regarded almost like family members, especially if born and raised in the house. Babylonian society in the Neo-Babylonian period was stratified, but also somewhat fluid. There was a clear hierarchy with the king and royal family at the top, followed by an elite class of priests and high officials, and below them the general free population, and below them the slaves. Yet within this hierarchy, individuals could and did move up or down based on fortune, merit, and sometimes misfortune. We mentioned those debt slaves. Well, that's one of the misfortunes. The Babylonian terms for social classes certainly show how they viewed their society. A cuneiform tablet from the old Babylonian period, with the concept still applied later, might characterize people as awilum, mushkenum, and wardum. Now let's start with the awilum, literally man or gentleman, a free person with full citizen rights, often a property owner. These were the upper and middle class of Babylon, landowners, merchants, master craftsmen, and officials. An oilum was ideally independent, not beholden to a superior except the state. In practice, many oilum were wealthy families who owned fields or urban houses and could afford to hire labor or buy slaves. If you were an oilum in Babylon, you had access to the courts and legal protections. For example, the law would impose heavier penalties on anyone who harmed you unjustly, as opposed to if you were a lower status. Now next is the mushkenum, often translated as commoner, sometimes dependent. Well, they were also free, but typically of lower socioeconomic status than an oilum. The mushkenum may not have owned land. They might rent property or work on lands owned by the king or temple. They could be craftspeople, laborers, small traders. Mushkenum, though, were not slaves. They had legal rights and could marry, own movable property, etc. But they possibly paid less taxes, and interestingly, some laws showed that they received different compensation for injuries. For instance, in older Babylonian law, if a wealthy man, an oilum, put out another oilum's eye, his own eye would be put out. The famous eye for an eye principle, quite literally. But if he put out the eye of a commoner, mushkenum, the punishment was a fine of silver. This suggests the law valued the commoner's well-being monetarily rather than exacting equal physical punishment. One might see this as a class-conscious form of justice. It provided restitution in a way that actually benefited the injured commoner. Money could be more useful than the perpetrator's suffering. And then there were the wardum, the slave class. As discussed, slaves could be born into slavery or become slaves due to debt or war captivity. Although slaves were property, Babylonian slaves had some protections. A master who killed his slave could be prosecuted, and if a slave was severely abused or maimed by an owner, the law might compel the owner to set them free. This is attested in earlier law codes. Slaves could own a small personal stash of goods called a slave's peculium, and they also could enter into contracts on their master's behalf. In daily life, slaves in Babylon did all manner of work: domestic service, agricultural labor, and even skilled trades if they were trained for it. Some temple complexes employed many slaves to work in the fields and workshops. And it's telling that Babylonian records often list slaves by name alongside their work assignments, acknowledging their role in the economy. Also, a slave who earned favor might be formally adopted by his master as a son, which sounds extraordinary, but it did occur, and it of course granted the slave freedom and inheritance rights thereafter. And so between free and slave, there was also a category of semi-free laborers tied to institutions. For example, temple serfs, in Akkadian shirku, were individuals who were not enslaved, but owed labor to the temple as a kind of hereditary duty. The Yale tablets from Uruk's Eanna temple, at the time of Nebuchadnezzar I, revealed that these temple dependents could rise to significant administrative positions while still technically bound to temple service. They could marry and live normal lives, but were obliged to work for the temple a certain number of days, or certain tasks. If they ran away to avoid this duty, the temple might send agents to retrieve them, though often at some cost which the temple would weigh against the loss of their labor. Well, despite all these class distinctions, Babylon was not a rigid class system. It was possible for a commoner to become wealthy through trade, or for a slave to become free and join the ranks of the commoners. Marriages could occur between classes. The boundaries were mostly economic. Now, the professions in Babylon were numerous and often inherited within families, so let's consider some typical figures that we might encounter in daily life. The farmer being first. Although Babylon was a great urban center, much of its subsistence came from the countryside. Many residents of the city actually worked fields just outside the walls or in nearby villages. A farmer in Babylon's environs could rise with the sun and tend his plot of barley or wheat, and they relied on that canal network to irrigate crops. Digging and maintaining irrigation canals was a constant concern. In the off-season, farmers might be conscripted to help dredge silt from the major canals. These farmers might own their land, or they might work land that belonged to the temple or king and pay a share of it as produce, share of the produce as rent or tax. Well, alongside farming, raising livestock was important. The Babylonian economy was heavily based on sheep and goats, things like wool, meat, milk, and then of course cattle as well for hides and also draft power. Tens of thousands of sheep grazed in the countryside around Babylon. However, since the immediate surroundings of the city were intensely farmed or inhabited, large flocks were often kept a bit further out, in the drier steppe regions to the north or south, watched over by nomadic or semi-nomadic shepherds. These shepherds would drive their flocks to seasonal pastures and then deliver wool or animals as required to the city's authorities or merchants. The Babylonian herdsman's life was more rustic, sleeping under the stars, protecting the flock from wolves, in contrast to the densely packed urban life. Nonetheless, the fruits of their labor were felt in town when great wool-plucking season came on. Babylonian texts mention that each spring, as the sheep naturally shed their winter coats, teams of workers plucked the wool, combing and collecting it, rather than shearing it with scissors. It was a massive task, of course. The wool would then be washed, sorted, and stored in warehouses. Nebuchadnezzar actually had a wool house to hold these piles of fleece. Many of those shepherds and shearers likely came into Babylon during this season, swelling the city's population temporarily and contributing to a festival-like bustle as raw wool changed hands, deals were made, and the temple or royal officials tallied the yield. Next will be the craftsmen and artisans. Babylon's streets were alive with crafts. Potters spun clay on their wheels, producing everything from simple jugs and bowls for household use to large storage jars and elegant fineware. They worked near their kilns, often situated at the city's edge due to smoke and fire hazard. Metalsmiths and bronze workers hammered out tools, weapons, and luxury goods like jewelry for those who could afford it. Bronze was the metal of choice for many items. Iron was known and used for some tools and weapons by this period, but bronze making remained widespread. And there were also gold and silversmiths, usually employed by temples or wealthy patrons to craft ritual objects, jewelry, and inlay for furniture. Their delicate work might take place in small workshops off the main market, and their products could end up adorning the statues of gods or the persons of rich Babylonians. Carpenters and woodworkers were valued since Mesopotamia had limited wood. They used imported cedar from Lebanon or local date palm wood to make doors, chests, and roof beams. So one might see a carpenter planing a beam in front of his shop, or assembling a ceremonial chair inlaid with shell and stone for a temple. Then there were the leather workers. They turned animal hides into sandals, belts, water skins, and even military equipment. Meanwhile, the brickmakers and construction workers were always busy. Babylon was famously under almost constant construction or repair, especially during Nebuchadnezzar's reign. when huge projects like the rebuilding of temples and fortifications were undertaken. These laborers would mix clay, straw, and water to form mud bricks, baking some in kilns for extra strength. Many such workers were hired labor or conscripted for state projects, working in gangs and supervised by foremen. Next, we have the merchants and the traders. Babylon's advantageous position and imperial reach made it a hub of international trade. In the markets, one could find goods that had traveled great distances, like lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar wood from the Levant, gold from Egypt or Nubia, and spices from as far as India. Babylonian merchants often specialized. Some were grain merchants, others dealt in textiles, others in precious metals. These merchants might have been among the wealthiest commoners. They operated by caravan or riverboat, and one can imagine a Babylonian merchant setting out with a caravan of donkeys loaded with woven cloth and jars of date syrup, heading west to trade in a Levantine port, and returning months later with copper ingots and rare timber. Some merchants worked closely with the palace or temples, effectively acting as agents in long-distance trade or managing large estates. The house of Egibi is a famous example, an entrepreneurial family in Babylon whose records spanning the 6th century BCE show them lending money, renting lands, and trading goods. The Egibi family became like bankers, demonstrating that private enterprise thrived under imperial stability. Next, we have scribes and officials. In an advanced urban society, bureaucracy was a fact of life. Babylon's scribes were the literate class who kept it all running smoothly. There were government scribes, working in the royal administration, keeping tax records, drafting letters, and issuing decrees. There were temple scribes, managing the considerable assets of the temple estates, and recording offerings and rituals. And then there were private scribes who hired out their skills. For example, a merchant might pay a scribe to write a letter or inventory. Scribes also doubled as scholars. They were the ones who copied literary texts, like the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Enuma Elish creation epic, onto library tablets and studied omens and stars. An average day for a city scribe might involve sitting cross-legged on a floor mat in an office, a damp clay tablet on a board in front of him, stylus in hand, carefully impressing lines of cuneiform. Scribal life could be quite comfortable. It was less physically demanding than manual labor, and carried prestige with it. Yet it required intense training and precision. Mistakes in record-keeping could anger a superior or a god. Scribes often wore a fringed garment that signified their status and carried a stylus as a badge of office tucked behind the ear. They formed a sort of intellectual class, of many of whom kept the lore of mathematics, astronomy, and literature alive. And of course, thank God we have them, because if we didn't, well, this video would be a lot more based on speculation. Now next we have the priests and priestesses. Religion permeated daily life in Babylon as much as anywhere else, as serving the gods was a full-time occupation for many. The city's main deity was Marduk, and his high priest was a powerful figure who interacted with the king. But beyond the high priest, there were many cult personnel. They performed the daily rituals in the temples. Every morning, afternoon, and evening they tended the statues of the gods, feeding them with offerings of food and drink, dressing them in fine clothes and jewelry, and performing prayers. A typical priest's day might start before dawn, purifying himself with water and donning white linen garments, then entering the temple's holy sanctuary to awaken the god's statue with a hymn. Priests were also scholars in many cases, knowledgeable in hymns, incantations, and the interpretation of omens. Some even specialized as diviners, while others were exorcists, called upon to perform rituals to cure sickness or rid a household of spirits. There were also priestesses, some of high rank, especially in the service of goddesses like Ishtar. These women might have roles in music and song during temple ceremonies, or manage the temple's property. One notable group were the Naditu priestesses of Marduk's father god Enlil. These were usually women from noble families who were dedicated to celibate temple service. On festival days, priests and priestesses would lead processions, carrying sacred objects, singing and playing drums and lyres, as the populace lined the streets to watch the grandeur. So let's talk about the everyday diet of the Babylonian people, shall we? Well, bread and beer, often called the staff of life in Mesopotamia, were truly the staples. In fact, one Mesopotamian myth, the Epic of Gilgamesh, you might have heard of it, uses the act of eating bread and drinking beer as the defining transition from wild animal-like existence to civilized human life. In the story, the wild man Enkidu is introduced to human food. The quote goes like this: Enkidu ate the bread until he was sated. He drank the beer, 7 jugs, and his heart grew light, his face glowed, and he sang with joy. Only after consuming those does Enkidu become fully human, ready to join society. But barley was the primary grain in Babylonia. Wheat was also grown, but less commonly. Barley was hardy in the hot, saline soils, and could be used to make bread, porridge, and beer. Beer, to the Babylonians, was a nourishing, mild alcoholic beverage, quite different to modern clear beers. In fact, really, if you saw it, you'd hardly even call it beer at all. It was unfiltered, meaning it retained suspended barley solids, giving it a porridge-like consistency. It was often cloudy and sipped with straws to avoid the grain husk sediment. But this thick brew was high in nutrients, a good source of plant proteins and B vitamins, and, of course, safer to drink than raw water. Then there were the date palms. They were another cornerstone of the diet. Date trees thrived in irrigated orchards around Babylon. The sweet dates were often eaten fresh in season and dried for storage. They provided a critical source of sugar and calories. Often dates were pressed into date syrup, a kind of molasses-like sweetener, or fermented into date wines. Vegetables and legumes were commonly grown in family gardens or small plots along canals. Onions and garlic were immensely popular, both for flavor and their hardiness and storage. Meat was less central in daily meals for common folk, but it wasn't absent. Fish from the Euphrates and canals provided a more accessible protein. Milk came from goats and cows. Fresh milk would spoil quickly, you see, so it was often processed into yogurt, butter, and a type of cheese. Butter, likely more like ghee or clarified butter in that climate, was a luxury fat for cooking. More common was sesame oil. When Babylonians wanted a more extravagant meal, they had a few options. The cuisine, as hinted by ancient recipes on tablets, could be quite complex. They made rich stews with multiple ingredients. For instance, a stew might include lamb, beets, herbs, thickened with barley cakes, essentially a hearty soup. Roasted fowl was enjoyed by those who could get it. Ducks and geese frequented the marshes near the Euphrates, and we know pigeon or dove cotes existed. So a well-off household stable might at a feast, feature roast duck with a pomegranate glaze, flatbreads with cheese and garlic spread, spiced lentil soup, and date cakes with honey for dessert. Now, Babylonians, like anyone, had to deal with the lean times as well. Crop failures or sieges could cause famine. And one Babylonian chronicle describes how during a siege earlier in the Assyrian period, people in a starved city resorted to eating their own children, an extreme and rare horror, but it shows the desperation of famine. Now, we've covered beer and date wine as the main drinks, but water was drunk, of course. But because the river and canal water could be contaminated, people often stored water in large jugs to let sediments settle, or boiled it when making gruel or brewing beer. In a Babylonian home, people used to sit on the floor and on raw mats, or reed mats rather, or low cushions, around a communal bowl or table spread. They used their right hand to pick up food, as the left hand was considered less clean, a custom that persists in many cultures. Spoons and knives existed, bronze or bone spoons for soups or porridges, knives to carve meat. But eating with hands and bread was a lot more common. At formal banquets, like those the king might host, we hear of more lavish arrangements. Couches for reclining and plenty of wine, music and skilled serving staff. The Bible's Book of Daniel, albeit a semi-legendary account, gives an image of a Babylonian royal feast, with wine goblets and many guests, which, even if exaggerated, reflects that the elite did enjoy opulent dining and partying, sometimes even to the point of drunken excess. But of course, in diet, Babylonians did have some awareness of health. They rinsed foods, knew how to avoid rotten grain, and combinations of foods were at times chosen for medicinal value. For instance, consuming garlic for its health benefits or brewing certain herbs into teas for stomach reliefs. When someone fell ill, dietary adjustments were part of treatments. Etc. You'd feed the sick person broth, or they would avoid certain foods to avoid aggravating illnesses. Overall, though, the nutritional profile of the Mesopotamian diet was strong. Grain for carbs, legumes for protein, vegetables and fruits for vitamins, and enough variety that, barring disasters, people had the basics needed for a healthy life. The common sight of well-fed Babylonians with a beer belly might even have existed, as copious beer and carbs would certainly do that. Now, Babylon's inhabitants, like any people, certainly expressed their identity and status through clothing and grooming. For men, the basic garment was a tunic or kilt-like wraparound skirt. Common men often wore a simple wrap of cloth around their waist reaching the knees, especially if working in the fields, something like a loincloth or kilt. In the city, a knee or ankle-length tunic with short sleeves was common, made either of wool or linen. Over this they might drape a shawl or cloak, especially in cooler weather, or for more formal dress. Mesopotamian men of the upper class sometimes wore elaborate fringed shawls wrapped around the body in a kind of toga-like fashion. One interesting note: the Greeks sometimes remarked on foreign dress. Herodotus describes Babylonian men wearing a linen tunic, woolen overrobe and white cloak, along with long hair and perfumed ointment on their hair. Men typically kept their hair moderately long and their beards well groomed. The famous images of Assyrian kings, with long squared beards in tightly curled locks, indicate a fashion that likely continued in Babylon, which had a shared culture with Assyria. A Babylonian gentleman might oil his hair and beard and use a curling iron, or have a barber curl and trim it into an orderly style. In the hot sun, headwear is of course useful. Workers would wrap a cloth or turban around their head to keep cool and absorb sweat. Straw hats might have been used as well, though depictions are scant. The elite might wear fancy headbands, or even a conical cap. And we know from texts that veils were worn by respectable women as a sign of modesty and status. In fact, one Babylonian law prohibited prostitutes or slaves from veiling, reserving the veiling for free married women. And speaking of women, the typical dress was a long dress, often one-shouldered or with wide sleeves that reached the ankles. It could be a simple tube of fabric or a more tailored gown tied with a sash at the waist. Like men, women also used shawls or wraps. The common style was a long robe that could be drawn over the head like a hood if needed, or draped around the shoulders. And Babylonians loved jewelry too, when they could afford it, that is. Both men and women wore seal stones on cords or chains around the neck or wrist. These cylinder seals or stamp seals were carved with one's personal design, with practical tools for signing documents. But they were also often beautiful, made from gemstones like carnelian or lapis. Cosmetics and grooming products were also used by Babylonian women, and to some extent the men too. They had black eyeliner called kohl, made from antimony or lead sulfide, which they applied to darken the eyelids and lashes. The same practice, well known in ancient Egypt. Eyes outlined with kohl, and that is Kohl, by the way, were considered beautiful and also thought to reduce glare from the sun. Footwear varied by activity. Often within the house or in good weather people went barefoot, but outdoors on hot sand or rough streets they wore sandals. Sandals were typically simple leather soles tied to the foot with leather thongs, and we found remains of such sandals and also references to them in texts. To the Babylonians, looking presentable was not just vanity, it had social and religious significance. Cleanliness was close to godliness in a literal sense, and one can certainly imagine a Babylonian couple on a festival day. The man wears a freshly laundered tunic and a new wool mantle with tasseled fringe, his beard trimmed and oiled, a bronze dagger at his belt for show. The woman wears her dyed red robe with a woven pattern at the hem, a light veil over her elaborately braided hair, kohl around her eyes making them dramatic, and her best jewelry, maybe copper earrings and a necklace with a carved carnelian pendant of the goddess Ishtar's symbol. They strolled down the processional way with their children, who were also scrubbed clean and dressed in miniature versions of adult clothes. The little girl with her hair in pigtails tied by colored yarn, and the boy in a proud new tunic that he will soon outgrow. Scenes like that lend a bit of color and vibrancy to Babylon's streets during holidays. Well, religion in Babylon was not a separate sphere of life. The Babylonians were devoutly polytheistic, worshipping a vast pantheon of gods, where at the apex stood Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, often called Bel or Lord. Babylon's rise to imperial power had been accompanied with the elevation of Marduk to the king of gods, a status celebrated annually at the New Year festival. For the average Babylonian, daily religious practice might begin at home. Blessings and omens were also constantly sought, though. As one left the house, it wouldn't be unusual to whisper a quick plea to Shamash, the sun, as he climbed up in the sky. But before that, you'd find many households maintaining a small shrine or altar, perhaps in the corner of the main room or in the courtyard, where they'd seek a few more simple blessings. A family typically venerated a personal deity, a sort of guardian god who watched over them. This could be, for example, a minor form of Marduk or another god that the family felt close to. So each morning the head of the household might pour a libation to the household gods, or burn a bit of incense, or something, leave some food, something like that. But really, the main part of religious life was the temple, and the temples of Babylon were among the most important sites in the city. There were many temples too. Esagila, the great temple of Marduk near the ziggurat at Emenanki, and the Temple of Ishtar, the Temple of Nabu at nearby Borsippa, also held shrines at Babylon, and others for Ninurta, Gula, Adad, etc. Scattered through the districts, you'd find all sorts of temples for different gods and goddesses. Once again, polytheism. These temples were not just religious centers, but also economic powerhouses. They owned lands, employed people, distributed charity. But focusing on the religious aspect, each day in the major temples, rituals were conducted largely behind closed doors by the clergy. The gold statue of a god, a wooden figure overlaid with gold and dressed in fine clothes, was housed at the innermost sanctuary where only priests could enter. Common people did not witness the inner rituals, but they could participate in the temple in other ways. Visiting the temple to pray or make a vow was quite common. For instance, a woman hoping to conceive a child might go to Ishtar's temple, bring a small offering, and praying to the goddess of fertility. A merchant embarking on a journey might visit Nabu's shrine and pledge that if he returns safely and profitably, he will donate a portion of his earnings, or perhaps fund a new silver lamp for the temple. Festivals were, of course, the high points of communal life. The greatest was the Enkidu, or the New Year festival held at spring equinox. Babylon's New Year festival was a dramatic public spectacle, lasting 12 days. People got a holiday from work to partake in it too. Key elements included processions, where the statues of the major gods, Marduk, Nabu, Ishtar, were brought out of their temples and paraded through the streets and along the processional way. Well, besides Enkidu, there were other festivals. Each deity had feast days. For example, Ishtar's celebrations might involve ceremonial reenactments of her myths, music, and dance. There's also evidence that at a temple of Ishtar, sacred marriage rites were performed during some festivals, possibly a ritual where a priestess and the king spent a night together in the temple to ensure fertility for the land. Whether this was a physical ritual or symbolic is debated, but it shows how religion, sexuality, and kingship intersected. Now, on a more everyday level, superstition and magic were certainly around. Babylonians wore amulets to ward off evil. A common fear was demons, and not the demons in the later Christian sense of devils opposed to the gods, but rather malevolent or mischievous spirits that could cause disease or misfortune if not kept at bay. The famous demon, Lamashtu, was thought to prey on infants and pregnant women. So, to counter her, families hung amulets of the demon Pazuzu over cradles, a kind of protective demon who was the enemy to Lamashtu. But once again, within that same demonic classification. Parents would recite lullabies that doubled as prayers to the moon god Sin to watch over their sleeping children at night. And if someone fell gravely ill, a healer, often the exorcist priest, the Ashipu, would come to perform rituals, which involved recitations to drive out the demon of illness and the burning of pungent herbs to cleanse the air. But they also had practical medicine, using plants, minerals, salves, but it was always accompanied by incantations. In any case, we should note how religion also intersected with education and science. Scribes who studied astronomy did so initially to improve the accuracy of omens and calendars for worship. The astronomical diaries, compiled by Babylonian scholars, in short served as a religious need, as they constituted a remarkable scientific record. So a priest astronomer might spend his night on a ziggurat platform mapping stars, but then by day he would advise the temple on when to schedule the next feast or how to appease the gods if, well, something bad appeared in the sky. And with all that being said, that's where we're going to leave it for today. Hour and 10 minutes in, not too bad. I'd like to thank the top tier patrons: Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Gary, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfitnir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Kukubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftus, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtsey, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Carrie, KTP, Lovely, Boma, Kevin, Marissa, Altazakin, Lucy, Julianne, Rosie, Tivolo, Chris, Apocalyptic, Brandy, Wolfsbane, Dude, Brinny, Aidan, Fabian, Michael, Agworm, Prince of Persia, River, Indian Trail, Catherine, Alexa, Big Gun 101, Brandy, Pesty Hun, Stevie, Jessica, Scott, Gail, Emily, Jade, Jake, Demon's Toe, Mason, John, Magenta, and Dumpster. Thank you all so much. And, well, we've had fun together today, I think. Perhaps you'll like more daily life videos. I should make more of them. I want to do one about Kyoto during the height of its time. Daily life for those people. That could be interesting. Anyway, let me know what you want to hear. But for now, let's all have a good little rest. Good night, lots of love to you all, and I will see you next time. Farewell for now.